Hello and welcome to another Sheriff of Sodium video podcast, The Rise and Fall of USMLE Step 1. This is a talk that I got to give as a virtual grand rounds for another institution. Now, the reason that we're talking about the rise and fall of USMLE Step 1 goes back to a decision that was announced several months ago on February 12th, 2020. And I realized that you all out here in the land of Lincoln may have been too preoccupied celebrating Abraham Lincoln's 211th birthday. But it turns out there was a very important announcement made that very day. Here's the headline a couple of days later from Medscape. Momentous USMLE change. New pass-fail format stuns medicine. News that the USMLE program will change its Step 1 scoring from a three-digit number to pass-fail starting January 1st, 2022 has set off a flurry of shocked responses from students and physicians. And among the shocked responses they cited was, of course, my own, where I said that I was stunned. And I think that many of you probably were too when this decision was announced. And really, that's what I want to dig into in the time that we have together. How did it come to pass that a multiple choice question test of basic science took on such an outsized role in medical education and residency selection? How did the test become so powerful and then collapse under its own weight? And perhaps most importantly, what are we going to do once we don't have these three-digit scores? What can we do to build a better system? And just as is the case for so many other things, the best place to begin our quest for answers is in the beginning. And so that's what we're going to do in Chapter 1. We're going to go all the way back to the beginning, to the formation of the National Board of Medical Examiners, which are the gentlemen that you see here on this first picture. The National Board of Medical Examiners was founded to address a simple but important problem in American medical practice, and that problem is this. Our founding fathers did not designate to the federal government an authority to regulate the practice of medicine. That power is reserved by the states. That the states have broad authority to decide who can and can't practice medicine was affirmed by the Supreme Court in the case Dent versus West Virginia in 1889. Mr. Dent, the plaintiff, had been practicing medicine even though he hadn't graduated from medical school. And he argued that the state had no authority to limit his practice of a lawful trade. The Supreme Court disagreed and said that each individual state has the authority to decide who can and can't be a doctor in that state. That created some issues because a physician who was licensed in one state couldn't easily move to a new state and begin practicing, not without meeting the licensure requirements of that new state. So here is the president of the American Medical Association, Dr. William Rodman, who was also the first president of the NBME, describing the situation in 1916. Here was a man who had graduated from Harvard Medical College, passed the Massachusetts State Board of Health, had achieved an enviable position in Boston, and then on account of his commanding position in thoracic surgery was called to preside over the department at the Mayo Clinic. And he had to take the Minnesota State Board examination before he could practice medicine. Is that right? Is there any man who will say that it's right? So that is the very problem that the NBME was formed to address. And they sought to create an examination that would be of such high quality that anyone who passed it could be licensed with confidence in any state in the United States of America without need to take additional exams. And that brings us to Chapter 2, Evolution of the NBME exam, from its original form to the USMLE series that we know today. But before we trace that history, I want to tell you what you're looking at here. This is a key. You could get one of these keys by passing the NBME examination. Once you passed, you became a diplomat of the National Board, which is what the DNB here stands for. And this was considered a high honor. Such an honor, in fact, that some people would wear these keys on their person. See, back in them days, you couldn't brag about your Step 1 score on Student Doctor Network or Reddit, but nobody could stop you from twirling your key as you made your rounds in the hospital. This is a partial outline of the first NBME exam. It was administered in Washington, D.C. from October 16th to the 21st, 1916. Now, importantly, when I say October 16th to 21st, I don't mean that you could take the exam on any one of those days. I mean the exam itself took 5 days because the original NBME exam was comprehensive. When the NBME set out to create an exam that would vouch for a physician's quality in any state in the United States of America, they did so by creating an exam that tested in a very practical way all of the physician's skills that a doctor in those times might have had. This format, I think, is important. You may note there were no multiple choice question tests on this exam. There were oral exams, essays, and a number of practical exams, including a practical exam that took place at the Garfield Memorial Hospital in Washington, D.C., where examinees had to go and take a history and physical from a real patient and then withstand an oral examination about their findings by one of the NBME examiners. In many ways, the NBME's exam was a big success. What I'm showing you here is a map of states in the United States that accepted the NBME certificate. And as you can see, starting with a handful of states in 1916, most states by 1927 were convinced of the exam's quality and honored the NBME certificate. Of course, the exam had a little bit of a problem. It was very cumbersome to administer a comprehensive examination of this format. I mean, if you think that students complain today about having to take an exam like USMLE Step 2 CS, where you have to travel to, one of 5 cities and examine standardized patients, imagine being able to travel to one city in an era before airplanes and interstate highways to take a 5-day exam that only 50% of people may pass. It wasn't really a very good business model. And as you can see, although the growth of test takers increased from 1915 to 1955, there still were only a few thousand candidates taking the examination each year. But at the same time that the NBME unveiled their comprehensive examination, Frederick J. Kelly, an educator in Kansas, was unveiling a different type of examination altogether, the multiple choice question test. Here's a snippet of a test he designed as his PhD thesis, the Kansas Silent Reading Test. Multiple choice question tests offered several advantages over other formats. One was objectivity. If you were grading an essay or an oral exam, you might have somebody who gets different scores from different examiners, but there's no debate about whether an apple or an orange has a thinner peel. You circle one or you circle the other. A second advantage is that a test like this can be graded very quickly. That became even more true once IBM developed a test scoring machine. The first thing that you could just mark on the page and run it through this machine, and it could grade 800 of these tests in an hour. Suddenly, the NBME's comprehensive exam format didn't look so good. I mean, as a business decision, it was a no-brainer. I mean, if you used multiple choice question paper and pencil tests, all you had to do was keep this test form secure, but you could administer them anywhere in the country. They became very portable, and you could scale up your exam a whole lot better than you can with a comprehensive exam. And so not long after this, the NBME began a serious debate about what the format of his exam really should be. Should it be a paper and pencil multiple choice question test, or should it include practical components? Arguing eloquently against using multiple choice question testing format was Dr. Chandler McCuskey Brooks of the National Board of Medical Examiners. He said, a multiple choice question test requires an ability to read quickly and to think quickly and accurately. It emphasizes facility of thought and store of information rather than the ability to reason. Students can be trained to succeed in multiple choice examinations, and they can organize their information in such a way to make it more useful for that type of examination. This type of examination, in my opinion, is not the organization of information which a scholar would seek. As the sole means for estimating educational accomplishment, they are totally inadequate, and when so used, tend to have a pernicious influence. And although that last line especially would prove to be prophetic, the business advantages of switching to multiple choice question test format were too great. And you can see the growth in the NBME exam in the years after they switched to a multiple choice question test format, with a tenfold increase in the number of people taking the test. Now, interestingly, there were some states, as you'll see here, who in 1954 gave up accepting the NBME certificate because of the format change. But by 1990, every state in the United States except for Texas had accepted the NBME's exams. In fact, the NBME exams were so successful, but by the 1960s, all of the individual state exams had gone away, and instead we had a two-pathway approach to medical licensure in the United States. If you were a U.S. medical graduate, you could take the NBME's Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3 exams and become licensed. Or because there were some states that did not accept the NBME exam, you could take the FLEX, the Federation Licensing Exam, which was a product created by the Federation of State Medical Boards and the NBME. Now, if you were an international medical graduate, you were not allowed to sit for the NBME exams. So instead, you took the ECFMG examination, and then you took the FLEX, and then you got your license. It was in this era that there was a dramatic increase in the number of international medical graduates who sought residency training and practice opportunities in the United States. And you can see that by the number of ECFMG exam takers increasing from the 1950s to the 1970s. And just as today, issues regarding immigration are thorny and politically loaded. And by 1980, many were convinced that we were headed toward an excess surplus of physicians in the United States and that this pipeline needed to be shut off. And so, as you can see in this report that went to the Secretary of Department of Health and Human Services, there was a recommendation that the number of graduates of foreign medical schools entering the United States should be severely restricted. It went so far as to say if this cannot be accomplished, the undesirable alternative would be to reduce the number of entrants to U.S. medical schools. It was explicitly to address this looming physician surplus that the NBME stepped in and created a new exam called FGEMS, or Foreign Graduate Examination in the Medical Sciences. And that became a prerequisite to getting ECFMG certification and taking the FLEX. But FGEMS was a tough exam. If you think step 1 and step 2 are tough, FGEMS was like taking both of them on the same 2-day period. There were 950 multiple choice questions taken over a 2-day period in the basic sciences and clinical sciences. And again, you had to do that even to sit for the FLEX. The basic science component had a pass rate that was in the 20% range. And although FGEMS was successful in reducing the number of international medical graduates who sought residency training or licensure opportunities in the United States, it also set in motion political events that ultimately undid this two-pathway system to licensure. Because you see, many international medical graduates are US citizens who go to school in the Caribbean or other places overseas, and they asserted that this was unfair and that the system was rigged against them. They basically had to take the NBME Part 1 and Part 2 exams, except on the same day for FGEMS, before they could even take the FLEX. And they said, why can't we take the NBME exams just like US medical students? The NBME refused. And so they made their case to several states, and they convinced legislators there of their position, and these states were prepared to implement legislation that would outlaw the use of the NBME exams for making licensure decisions. It was under the threat of legislative action that the NBME and the Federation of State Medical Boards met in 1989 to create a single examination for medical licensure, to get rid of this separate but equal two-pathway system, and instead have a single exam that every person would take to demonstrate their fitness to receive a state medical license. It took a couple of years to put the proposal for a single pathway to licensure into practice, but by the time that happened, it brings us to 1992. And that brings us to chapter 3 in our saga, because 1992 is when we had the confluence of 3 critical events in medical education and residency training that set in motion the next 3 decades. The first was the birth of the USMLE. In 1992, we had the first administration of the Step 1 exam, which represented the realization of Dr. Rodman's dreams for the NBME. Their mission statement had been achieved. There was now one exam that a physician could take and get a license anywhere in the United States from sea to shining sea. And in some ways, this could have been the end of our story, except for one important thing, a very important decision that was made in setting up the USMLE exam. And that decision was that results would be reported with scores. Now, that wasn't new. In fact, it was a time-honored tradition at the NBME that their exams received a score. Now, state licensing bodies didn't use that. You either passed or you failed the exam. And so from that standpoint, simply getting a pass or fail designation would have been adequate to serve the exam's purpose. However, there had long been a belief at the NBME that it was unfair to examinees, that examinees deserved to get that kind of feedback. Here's a quote from a member of the National Board of Medical Examiners in 1937. The issue of grading in examinations deserves special consideration. A mere distinction between passing and failing may satisfy the poor student, but even the mediocre student is entitled to know how far he escaped the executioner. And ultimately, it was that argument that carried the day. The USMLE would have scores because it benefited the students, it benefited the test takers to have scores. And that wouldn't really have been a consequential decision if not for two other changes that also happened in 1992. One was the proposal by the Association of American Medical Colleges to create ERAS, the Electronic Residency Application Service. Because back in the day, applying to residency wasn't something you did on a computer. You could apply to a program, but you had to request the application from the program itself, type up the application into the form that they provided, and then your school had to collate all of your letters of recommendations and transcripts, and the programs were always in a state of flux about whether they had received a completed application for all these candidates. It was a pain in everyone's butt, and the idea of having ERAS had broad appeal. It took a few years to get it going, but by 1995, 1996, several specialties were using ERAS, and so students could fill out their application on a computer disk like this and then walk it over to the dean's office where it could be loaded up and sent out to residency programs. The third important change that took place in 1992 was a change in the residency application marketplace. As you can see, in 1992, that was the last year where there were actually more PGY1 positions available than there were applicants in the match. Ever since then, there have been more applicants for the available positions as reflected by this ratio that's hovered around 0.75, 0.8 for the past 25 years or so. Individually, each of these big changes may not have had as much of an impact, but together they set in motion something that I like to call application fever. And that's what we're going to discuss in Chapter 4. Both the term and the concept of application fever will be familiar to you if you have followed me on social media, but if not, it is essentially the phenomenon whereby applicants to residency programs today apply to many, many more programs than they did even a few years ago. And those a few years ago applied to even more programs than their predecessors. Application fever was set in motion by a relative reduction in the number of residency spots available. At the same time that that happened, the Electronic Residency Application Service gave applicants the means to apply to as many programs as they wanted. And the USMLE Step 1 score gave program directors the tools that they needed to withstand this barrage of applications. If you consider the decision of how many programs to apply to from the standpoint of an individual applicant, the applicant is stuck in a prisoner's dilemma. And that's exactly what's modeled here from this paper in Journal Graduate Medical Education in 2015. Basically, the matrix shows applicant A and applicant B who are both trying to achieve a residency program position in the specialty of their choice. And if you out-apply your competition, you enjoy a relative advantage in this competition. You may have only a 2% chance of not matching in your first choice specialty, while your competition who applied to fewer programs, they end up with a 10% chance. And when you model it this way, you can see that the only way that you can achieve your best possible outcome, this slim chance of going unmatched, and the only way that you can avoid your worst outcome of this 10% chance of not getting what you want, the only way to do that is by over-applying, by out-applying your opponents. And this is the phenomenon that applicants today are stuck within. And so it shouldn't be surprising to you that this is what the number of applications over time look like. You can see for US medical graduates last year, they submitted on average 65 applications. That is 6-5. It's a big number, but it pales in comparison to the number of applications that international medical graduates submit, which is over twice as many. And you can see how each of these figures has been steadily rising over time, with a doubling in the number of applications that US graduates submit over just a little bit more than a decade. All specialties are impacted by application fever. Here I'm showing you the mean number of applications submitted by a graduating USMD student in various specialties. And as you can see, at the top are specialties that are known as being highly competitive, like dermatology and orthopedic surgery. But even specialties that are not traditionally competitive specialties, such as your own internal medicine, where the average student now submits 48 individual applications, have been affected by application fever. Now, some of you may be looking at this graph a little bit quizzically and saying, you just told me that the mean number of applications submitted by a US student was 65, but really there's only a few specialties that are above that. And the specialties that take more people are actually on the lower end. So how is that figure accurate? Well, it's because that another trend in application fever is submitting applications to more than one specialty. Here, for example, are the cross-specialty applicant data from ERIS, and this matrix shows specialties across um, the columns and rows, and then the intersection of each cell tells you the number of applicants who applied in both of those specialties. So for example, if we look at categorical internal medicine programs, there were 1,404 applicants who also applied in anesthesiology, 424 who also applied in dermatology, over 1,000 who applied in emergency medicine, and so on. And look, let me be very clear. I'm not trying to trash mouth students who apply to multiple specialties. I realize that there are legitimate reasons in many cases to do this. You may have people who have extreme geographic limitations or who are sincerely undecided between various specialties, or who are applying in a highly competitive specialty and want to have a backup to ensure that they can practice as a physician. And I get all that. But in the aggregate, it's hard for me to look at this table and conclude that this is anything other than, in a broad sense, another manifestation of application fever. And this is what application fever looks like for programs. This is the ratio of applications received to the number of positions that the program is trying to fill. As you can see, for specialties that are not known as being extremely competitive, such as family medicine or internal medicine, where they receive many applications from international medical graduates, program directors may have, for your specialty, 150 applications received for every one spot that they're trying to fill in the match. This is what program directors are up against with application fever in the year 2020. When you look at those red bars from the previous slide, I think it's very easy to see from the program standpoint why so many program directors have gravitated toward using Step 1 scores in residency selection. They're overwhelmed. But at the same time that they're starting to get more and more and more applications, here comes a test that for the first time gives them a common measuring stick, not just for some applicants, but for all applicants. Remember when we had the two-test system, you could look at NBME exam scores if you wanted, or you could look at flex exam scores, but not all of your applicants would have taken either test. Suddenly in the USMLE era, we had a single measuring stick that you could use to evaluate all applicants, or to cull your pile of applicants from an unmanageable heap into a manageable pile that you could evaluate for interview. And that is what sets in motion Chapter 5, Step 1 Mania. Before I get into contemporary events, though, I want to share one last little historical tidbit, and that's this. The NBME had long had reservations about people using their exam scores for anything other than the exam's stated purpose, which is to inform decisions about licensure. In fact, they used to sternly warn people against doing that very thing, and here I will provide a representative example from the winter 1988 National Board Examiner. The National Board Part 1 and Part 2 examinations provide measurements of the basic science and clinical science knowledge of individual students that may be helpful in the overall assessment of students. Here, the bolding is original, and it is important to understand that the examinations have not been developed for the purpose of assessing preparation for postgraduate education. You'll notice that in the USMLE era, these types of disclaimers disappeared. Now here's a slide that captures the spirit of Step 1 Mania, and it shows you just how much residency selection criteria have changed. On the left, I've got a paper from the Journal of Medical Education that appeared in 1979. And on this, program directors have ranked factors that they used in ranking candidates. And sitting at the top of the list, you have the outcome of the interview. You see the dean's letter, you see honors and clinical clerkships, et cetera, et cetera. Appearing at number 23 on the list are scores on the NBME Part 1 examination. Contrast this to the 2018 Program Directors Survey, where 94% of program directors cite Step 1 scores as being important when deciding which candidates to interview. And in fact, when they assign an importance ranking, there are few things that are more important than Step 1 scores in making that decision. Here's another telling graphic from the NRMP Program Directors Survey. Percentage of programs that use Step 1 scores. 64% of residency programs, that's across all programs, all disciplines, use a specific target score, a cut score, to decide candidates to interview. It's therefore unsurprising that Step 1 scores play a very important role in which candidates get matched and which candidates don't. And here you can see the spread by specialty. The green bars show the range of Step 1 scores for people who did not match. The blue bars show the score range for applicants who matched for U.S. seniors. You can see also for competitive specialties, the average score for matched candidates, for example, in a field like dermatology or neurosurgery or orthopedics, is pushing 250. I doubt that anything on this slide is a surprise to anyone listening to this presentation. It certainly is not a surprise to medical students. They know that their Step 1 score is important. In fact, they know that it's so important that nothing else on their application matters if their Step 1 score is not high enough to pass that initial hard cutoff set by programs. Now this right here is my favorite slide about Step 1 Mania. It shows how the mean USMLE Step 1 score for first-time test takers from U.S. medical schools has increased from the test's beginnings in the early 90s until today. As you will see, the increase is not subtle. Now, I sometimes have people that want to argue with me about this slide and say that this rise is just because of better test prep resources. You know, students these days, they've got UWorld, they've got Sketchy Micro, they've got Pathoma, and that these things allow so much more efficient Step 1 prep that that's why scores are rising. And listen, I don't doubt for a minute that today's resources are better. But that's because there's a market for those things because the value of the Step 1 score has also increased. I sometimes like to use the example of the washing machine. You know, back before we had mechanical washing machines, washing clothes was a laborious and time-consuming process. And all of a sudden, when we had washing machines, suddenly that job got to be much more efficient. Now, you know what didn't happen when we had washing machines? What didn't happen was people washing their clothes day and night so they had the cleanest clothes on the block. All they did was they spent less time washing their clothes. And if all this was more efficient prep resources, you'd see students spending less time on Step 1 prep and achieving just the same scores as they did 30 years ago. Of course, that's not what this graph shows. Instead, this graph demonstrates the increasing premium that we've placed on the Step 1 score, because the value of your Step 1 score is really relative. If you get a 210, that's a good score if the average person is getting a 200. But when the average person's getting a 230, you need to have a 240 to be competitive for the most selective residency positions. And thus, students and the marketplace for test prep resources have responded accordingly. If you're still unconvinced about score creep in the era of Step 1 mania, then maybe this figure will convince you. This shows the distribution of USMLE Step 1 scores for first-time test takers from U.S. medical schools in 2016 to 2018. And as you can see, it's approximately normally distributed, with most scores nowadays falling in around the 230s range. Well, you may be interested to note that the USMLE scoring scale in the early 1990s was set to have a mean of 200 and a standard deviation of 20. Scoring right about here back in those days would have put you in the 85th percentile and opened the door to any number of prestigious residency programs. These days, if you score a 200, if you score at the mean from when the test was first started, then you are falling below the 9th percentile of all test takers. There's one other thing to point out here too. USMLE scores have never been recentered like the old SAT to make a number that provides the same relative performance. These increasing scores reflect the fact that students today are honest to God answering more questions correctly than those in the past. Step 1 mania is an arms race with no natural end. Now here's a fun graph. The length of first aid for the USMLE. from the first edition in 1993 to 2020. Now, of course, first aid is the Bible of step one preparation, and students are advised to, at a bare minimum, memorize every word of first aid before they take the step one exam. And you can see how first aid book has grown from a little 100-page volume to an over 800-page tome in this most recent edition. Now, again, you can look at this and try to be skeptical and say, oh, of course it's going to be bigger. We have more knowledge. We have to sell a book every year. It's going to have to grow, larger. But I think, again, you're missing the point. I think the book is getting bigger because the definition of what is high yield knowledge is changing as scores get higher and higher and higher. You want to have enough knowledge to score 200? Well, that's a certain volume of knowledge that might be pretty important. But as scores get higher and higher to 220, to 240, to 260, the type of information that students must learn to get those scores gets more and more esoteric and off the beaten path. We've reached the point of diminishing returns, and students have to spend more and more and more time to learn material that's less and less and less relevant to the care of their future patients. I frequently have people say, well, what is the problem with this? I mean, students are learning more basic science. They know more now than they did 20 years ago. How is any of this bad? And I sometimes like to ask those people, do you know what's on USMLE Step 1? And it's an honest question because if you're not in medical education or if you haven't taken the test recently, you probably have forgotten how esoteric some of that information is. I have a post on my website if you're interested that goes through some real USMLE Step 1 prep questions. And it's a nice refresher if you've been out of that game for a while. What the heck? Let's do a few of them together. What do you say? A 63-year-old homeless man is brought to the emergency department 1 hour after police found him unresponsive. His respirations are 30 per minute. Crackles are heard over the left upper and the entire right lung fields. Despite appropriate life-saving measures, he dies. A photomicrograph of a section of the right lung obtained at autopsy is shown. Which of the following mediators is the most likely cause of the position of the cell indicated by the arrow? Now, you might think that the makers of a licensure exam might be more interested in seeing which physicians knew how to help this poor guy before he died, or how we might take care of him. Nope. How did this cell get here? The answer to this important question, of course, is C5a. Let's do another. During an experiment, a southern blot analysis is done by digesting DNA samples with a single restriction endonuclease, separating the digestion products by gel electrophoresis and transferring them to a filter. The investigator probes the filter by exposing it to a complementary DNA clone that encodes a single immunoglobulin constant region. The figure shows the resulting pattern with DNA samples isolated from different organs. Assuming that there were no technical errors, the southern blot analysis results demonstrate which of the following processes. Now, if you're like me, it may have been a little while since you've gone into clinic and come out with the digestion products of your patient's cerebellum or pancreas. If that is the case, you may not have known that the correct answer was C, gene rearrangement. All right, one more. A 27-year-old man is admitted to the hospital 45 minutes after being involved in a motor vehicle collision. Physical examination shows a sluggish response to stimuli. Neurologic exam shows no other abnormalities. A skull X-ray shows a linear non-depressed basal skull fracture. 2 weeks later, the patient develops polyuria and polydipsia. Laboratory studies show a serum glucose concentration within the reference range, increased serum osmolality, and decreased urine osmolality. Following the administration of desmopressin, urine osmolality increases. The beneficial effect of this drug is most likely due to activation of which of the following? Now I love this USMLE question because you have a clinical vignette that comes up to an important clinical issue, the workup of polyuria and consideration of diabetes insipidus. And then it makes a hard turn into basic science. And here, the correct answer is A, adenylyl cyclase. And let me just say that, in my day job, I work up children who have diabetes insipidus. And not once has it ever occurred to me to even look up this factoid, much less memorize it so I can carry it around in my head for the rest of my career. So tell me again why we think these are the questions that we need to separate the wheat from the chaff in residency selection. And when I make this point and when I show these questions, the most frequent retort I get is, well, most USMLE Step 1 questions are very good. You cherry picked these esoteric ones. And I say, yes, that's the exact reason why Step 1 is adequate as a licensing exam to ensure that you have the basic fund of knowledge by answering those very good questions to become a doctor and to progress in your training. And I have no issue with Step 1 for that purpose. But what kind of questions do you think people have to answer correctly as scores get higher and higher and higher? Questions that are good and test basic concepts, or questions like these? So if we're going to use these USMLE Step 1 scores to make these important decisions about who gets an interview and who gets screened out, we ought to have some understanding about how the score is calculated. There are 280 questions on USMLE Step 1, but thanks to a little snafu earlier this spring where the USMLE proposed for a period of time giving a shorter version of the test to certain examinees, we learned that approximately 25% of the questions on the test are experimental items. And that leaves only 200 scored items. And if around 60% of items have to be answered correctly just to pass, that leaves only 80 questions to determine scores across the entire passing range from 194 up to 300. And now maybe I think we can start to see some of the fissures in the Step 1 based system that we created. And here's another, the test scores themselves are not actually that precise. Even if you do believe that understanding basic science in the extreme is the most important thing that we could possibly use to separate residency applications from one another, we still have to have some humility about the test as a psychometric instrument, because although we sometimes act like Step 1 scores are these indelible and perfectly precise measures of, um, of basic science knowledge, they're imprecise even in that regard. If you gave a Step 1 examinee a Step 1 exam on 2 different days, and the test covered the same types of questions, and the candidate neither gained nor lost any information between the first test administration and the other, the 95% confidence interval for their scores would span 24 points. 24 points. It's such a wide confidence interval that it means that to have 95% confidence that two applicants that you're reviewing actually have a difference in their basic science knowledge, their scores have to be 16 or more points apart. As a side note, I've asked some students and program directors, hey, what do you think that confidence interval is? And the most common guess that I get is 5 points. But all that aside, I think you got to admit it's been nice that we've had these 3-digit Step 1 scores, because without them, we'd have to confront the realities and the difficulties of application fever and comparing people from different backgrounds, and that's a hard task. But let's be honest about what Step 1 costs us. And among other things, there are opportunity costs. I mean, students put a lot of time into Step 1 prep, and that is time that necessarily could have been spent learning or doing something else. So let's put that in some context. Here's a paper from Academic Medicine. It was published in 2017, but it uses data from 2015. I think these figures are probably all higher recently. But it shows how much the average student was studying for Step 1. And this is just in the protected period. This doesn't even count studying that occurred while classes were still in session, only after classes are over. But in that period, students were studying 11 hours per day for 35 days. And given that there are 42,000 and some test takers, that ends up being 1,880 person years. Now, I don't really have an intuitive sense about how much person time is a lot of person time. Is that a lot? Is that a little bit? I don't know. So just for reference, let's compare it to some other human achievements. So here is Margaret Hamilton. She was the software genius who wrote the code that was responsible for the Apollo 11 mission landing on the moon. And that was a challenging task because she was really starting from scratch. You can see these books that she's standing next to. That's all the code that was written for that. And altogether, she and her team worked on that project for about 10 person years. Here, of course, is Francis Collins, who was the head of the NIH during the Human Genome Project. And at the outset, it was estimated that the Human Genome Project would take 30,000 person years to complete. So what do you think? 1880 person years every year. It falls somewhere between putting a man on the moon and the single most ambitious scientific project that's ever been accomplished. Does that seem like an appropriate amount of effort collectively for our students to be putting in, or maybe not? Because we're saying when we do that. And what we're missing is students are disengaged from anything in the curriculum that is not explicitly step one relevant. Here's a tweet. I thought this was a good one. It's what I see in my school. This is not, it doesn't reflect on the lecture at all. But you can see this is a typical lecture. This is from the University of Michigan. And I have other photos like this. Here's a more explicit example that someone tweeted to me. MS2 here. Tomorrow, I have a 3-hour interactive lab with psych fellows about identifying risks for suicide and violence in patients. Interesting, clinically relevant, would make me a better MD. I'm not attending though, because that'd be 3 hours of step one prep down the drain. Again, the point here isn't that lecture is good and that test prep is bad. The point is that students are forced to make this choice explicitly because of the priority that was being placed on step one scores. It's a cost of our step one based system, and we have to decide if the value outweighs that cost. And there are some costs of our step one based residency selection system that are hard to justify. Here, for instance, there's some data from academic medicine in 2019 that looked at step one scores among different demographic groups. And there are systematic differences by racial background and sex on step one performance. And when you see the magnitude of some of these differences, it's really hard to argue that they don't have a negative impact on diversity in graduate medical education. After all, 2/3 of programs are using hard cut scores. We also know that depression and burnout and suicide are distressingly common among medical students. And that's not a problem we can pin on step one. I'm not trying to do that. But I think it is a call to all of us to think carefully about the systems that we're creating. This paper, which appeared in Academic Medicine last year on the Step 1 climate in preclinical medical education, written by a group of US medical students on what they perceive in their own education, I think this very nicely synthesized for a lot of people the problems in the way that we were going. The students' paper received a lot of attention, not only because of the clarity of thought and logic that they presented, but also because of the companion that was written by the president of the NBME and the president of the Federation of State Medical Boards. The initial draft of that piece was opining about the potential risks and benefits of a pass-fail step one and included this comment that if students reduce time and effort devoted to preparing for step one, they may indeed devote attention to other activities that would prepare them to be good physicians. This would arguably be an ideal outcome for such a change. However, if students were to devote more time to activities that made them less prepared to provide quality care, such as binge watching the most recent Netflix series or compulsively updating their Instagram accounts, this could negatively impact residency performance and ultimately patient safety. And the authors were excoriated on social media for making a comment such as this, and I think rightly so, and it was scrubbed from the final printed version of the article. Nonetheless, this was some attention that inspired debate right around the time of the Invitational Conference on USMLE scoring. Having recognized some of the issues that we've discussed in the previous slides, the National Board of Medical Examiners and other stakeholder organizations organized a conference last March to discuss the future of USMLE scoring, if providing these three-digit scores was really the right thing to do moving forward for medical education and residency selection. Unsurprisingly, given the intensity of opinion and the complexity of some of the issues involved, there was not going to be a uniform consensus reached by the INCUS meeting, and I think that everyone involved realized that. Deliberations continued on, and there was a period of public comment, but ultimately it was the pass-fail side that carried the day. I've been asked several times why the pass-fail movement ultimately succeeded, and I think that the single best explanation is this. Regardless of whether you think that a scored USMLE benefits you, or it makes your life easier as a program director, or it hurts you as a medical educator, regardless of how this issue impacts you personally, there really is no retort to this argument from former Loyola professor and medical education rock star, Dr. Bill McGahee. Here's a quote from a paper in Academic Medicine in 2011, and I'm going to read it in full because it's that good. Physicians do not report for work in hospitals and clinics and spend the day answering multiple choice questions. Instead, they obtain patient histories and examine patients. They exercise judgment, express compassion and caring, solve problems, communicate with patients, families, and colleagues, educate themselves and others, perform complex clinical procedures, and display professionalism in many ways. Continued reliance on USMLE scores to predict the ability of individual trainees to perform these diverse tasks is unsupported by data. If I had a mic to drop, I would drop it right now, but I'm speaking into an internal computer microphone and I don't really want to break my computer. But I think this is such a good point, and it explains why, when the pendulum had swung as far as it did, why we needed a course correction. Now, obviously, not everybody was thrilled with the decision to pass fail. Particularly on social media, it was mocked, and just to capture the prevailing sentiment, I'll show you some of these memes. Um, Congratulations to the MS2s taking step one. You did it in January 22. You passed. We won't have that three-digit score, but congratulations. Here's your certificate of achievement. Or here's a good one. Program director says, next applicant, please. For applicants after 2022, they all look exactly the same. You can see they all just have a little P. Program directors are helpless. They cannot tell one from another. Or here's my favorite meme of all. Here's a Bernie Sanders program director who's unimpressed by a pass on step one. But now he starts to see a 98th percentile in the MCAT. He sees an ACT of 36 in high school. He sees 9, 10, 10 as APGAR scores, and he's about to lose his mind. But even better was the comments saying, honestly, I think a numerical APGAR puts way too much stress on fetuses. We should switch to a pass-fail system. They wouldn't be under so much APGAR pressure had the fetuses just did a better job of intrauterine networking and standing out during their third trimester rotations. I agree, but if we make the 1-minute APGAR pass-fail, then the 5-minute APGAR will just become the new 1-minute APGAR. This unduly pressures neonates who perform better right out of the oven rather than late bloomers. Now, if you couldn't tell by the way I've discussed some of these things in the talk, I support a pass-fail step one. Um, And I present this to show some of the polarity on this issue, which really can be pretty extreme. There are many people who believe that this is a horrible decision for all of medicine and is going to lead to more problems than it solves. And there's others who believe that it paves the way for a better future. And sometimes it seems like the two sides are so far apart that we can never reach consensus on anything. But other times, I think that we're actually pretty close. And so what I want to do here in the final chapter that I have with you is talk about the future. How do we take this pass-fail thing and turn it into a net positive for medical education and residency selection? And listen, this is a topic that I could talk about for a long time, and I'm not going to have the time to do that. And actually, I'm also making a deliberate decision to not be too prescriptive in this talk. And instead, I'm going to mention some things that I hope will inspire you to think about these issues and to work on them in some way. Of course, if you're not much interested in thinking or working on this issue, there is a ready-made path of least resistance, and that is simply to use USMLE Step 2 CK scores in place of the screening role of a scored USMLE Step 1. You may have seen this paper that came out of New England Journal of Medicine several weeks ago, including data from a survey of program directors this spring after the pass-fail change was announced, and 81% indicated that they would be increasing their emphasis on USMLE Step 2 CK scores. In some ways, using Step 2 CK scores would be an upgrade over using Step 1, insofar as the material that's tested on USMLE Step 2 CK is more easily brought to bear on the care of real human patients. But if you think that's the best solution, then I think you haven't been listening to this talk so far and my painstaking efforts to try to lead you through the history of Step 1 mania, because the negative effects that will result from this are completely anticipatable, and I think they're things we want to avoid. You know, Step 2 CK mania won't really be too much better than Step 1 mania. In fact, in some ways it'll be worse, because students, rather than being distracted from classroom learning that's not on the test, you're going to have students who are distracted from the experiential learning that should occur on the clerkships, because if all we value is the score, they're going to be living in U world the whole third year clerkships. And I don't think that's what we want. Instead, I think there's an opportunity to realign the things that we care about educationally with the things that we use for residency selection. But it starts with all of us having a shared vision of reality. Right now, we're stuck in an arms race, all of us. Program directors, applicants, medical schools, we're all focused on our own narrow self-interest. I'm a program director. I got to limit this pile of 2,000 applications to 200. I'm an applicant. I need to get the program for me. I'm a medical school. I want to have all my students match. All of those things, when we play this game to optimize our own outcomes, we end up with a system like what we have now. We have to think a little bit more broadly here because ultimately we're all on the same side. We all want to provide good care to patients. Students want to be good doctors. Schools want to graduate good doctors. Program directors want to train good doctors. We all ultimately want the same thing, and we can't expect people to act against their own self-interests. But we can configure systems in such a way that it turns a senseless arms race into a virtuous competition. If you consider residency selection from the standpoint only of individual applicants, then it's a zero-sum game. Whatever criteria we use, whether it's step one scores or memorizing digits of pi or what prestigious medical school you went to or didn't go to, whatever criteria we use, we will get a certain number of winners and a certain number of losers. And when one person wins, by necessity, someone else loses. But you can imagine that there are certain systems that we could set up that would benefit even the losers. If we train people to be the best doctors that they possibly can be, then even if they lose by not getting into, the program of their dreams, they still are better off for having competed in that competition. If we use senseless criteria or we go all in on unidirectional metrics, we're going to lose that value. My second point is that when we're setting up these kinds of systems, we need to be honest with ourselves that numbers alone will mislead us. Sometimes people mistake me for someone who hates all standardized testing. I'm not opposed to all tests or all standardized tests even. I am opposed to using tests for purposes for which they function poorly against the known psychometric properties of the test and in ways that are ultimately harmful to the people who use those scores. I'm more against the misuse of tests is what I'm trying to say. Tests give us a number, and as far as it goes, that's good. That can be a good thing. That can be a useful piece of information to use along with other pieces of information in making an informed decision. Now, the picture in the back of this slide is of US soldiers in the Vietnam War. And I chose this picture because that was the setting of one of the most powerful examples of the misuse of objective data. It came from Robert McNamara, the architect of the Vietnam War and the US Secretary of Defense. Here's a quote from a piece that I wrote not long ago. To McNamara, the complexities of conflict could be reduced to simple mathematical equations. So long as the body count for hostile Viet Cong soldiers was greater than that of US personnel, victory would be inevitable. McNamara directed the deployment of increasing numbers of offensive ground troops to Vietnam and obsessively reviewed body counts, prisoners taken, weapons seized, and tons of bombs dropped, figures that rose continuously, even as the United States slowly lost the war. By 1967, McNamara grew skeptical that the war was winnable, and he tendered his resignation. Of course, this whole experience has given rise to the term the McNamara fallacy. And this is the fallacy that results when we measure whatever can be easily measured, such as, oh, I don't know, basic science knowledge. It's easily measured. But then that causes us to disregard things that cannot be measured easily. And then we start to presume that things that can't be measured easily are not important. And in an extreme, we presume that things that are not measured easily do not even exist. Sometimes when we debate about residency selection criteria, I hear the word objective used to mean true or real, and the word subjective used as code for biased or false or unreliable. And I think if we're going to discard everything that's subjective from the residency selection process or from any other complex decision making, you're really conceding all of the value of human intellect and reason. Objective data and numbers are more likely to help us make a good decision when we're taking those numbers in the context of some bigger picture. And so when we build a new system, when we try to realign our incentives, we need to keep this principle in mind. And it's for that reason, as well as some others, that we need to embrace holistic review. Holistic review is the only way to get out from under this arms race phenomenon. We've got to be honest that there's no multiple choice question test that's going to perfectly and precisely capture all the attributes that we care about in a potential physician trainee. We've got to stop acting like we can do it that way. If we don't have holistic review, if we don't consider applicants in total, then we leave a lot of talent on the table. Instead, we need to have a system where we say, hey, knock my socks off. I mean, show me what you can do. Distinguish yourself in the area where you are most equipped to distinguish yourself. Instead, we're treating our medical students like they're a tube of toothpaste. We just apply pressure and they all come out one way. USMLE Step 1 or Step 2 CK scores are great for making an apples to apples comparison. And that's wonderful if you live in a world where there's only, but we live in a world where there's apples and oranges. And comparing them is inherently difficult. And to do it well requires hard work to build a system that's mission based and values driven in order to do it well and to do it fairly. The best solution is not just to outsource all that hard work to the NBME. But if we want holistic review, we need application reform. In many ways, over-application is the original sin in the whole residency selection mess that we found ourselves in. And unless we address it, program directors will gravitate to whatever convenience screening metric is available. I'm a believer in application caps. I think that most students will be better off by conceding their freedom to carpet bomb programs with limitless applications in return for the opportunity to actually have somebody read their application. And I think that medical education in general will be much better off if we facilitate that type of system. But even if we have application caps, and even if we have holistic review, and even if we keep numeric metrics in the proper context, we still must demand meaningful evaluation. Unfortunately, many medical schools have abdicated their responsibility to provide meaningful and thoughtful evaluations of their students in ways that are useful to residency program directors, and we have to do better. Because if the saga of Step 1 Mania teaches us nothing else, it should teach us this. Medical students will rise to the bar that we set. We owe it to them to make sure that the bars that we set are meaningful and measure the things that we really care about. And with that, I'm out of time. In fact, I think I'm over my time. So I thank you for your attention. And I thank you even more for the opportunity to speak with you today. I hope I've given you some appreciation about how the systems that we've created or the systems that we've allowed to develop and persist have taken us to a place that isn't where we want to go. And I hope I've inspired you to believe that we can make new systems. If you don't already, please feel free to follow me on Twitter. I'm at JB Carmody. Many of the things that I've discussed in this talk are much more fleshed out on my own website, which is thesheriffofsodium.com. Thanks again, everybody.